June 2nd of 2020 marked the 11th anniversary of the release of Red Faction Guerrilla, a black sheep of sorts in the now very vast and very homogenous genre of open-world action games. It's the third game in the Red Faction franchise and was developed by Volition Interactive, the same folks behind the prior two entries in this series as well as the Saints Row franchise. However, don't expect wacky, comical romps and ridiculous characters. Guerrilla is a much more, dare I say, grounded experience compared to the likes of Saints Row. Not that I wish to imply that this isn't goofy, because it absolutely is, but you can tell that the theme and the feel of this game is not meant to be one of humour. Like the first game, Red Faction Guerrilla is set on Mars, a cold, borderline, inhospitable dust bowl filled with all manner of hardships, poverty and death. Instead of the dank subterranean tunnels of Red Faction 1 being your stomping ground, however, Guerrilla takes place on the surface. Decades after the Ultor Corporation was quashed by the titular group and the now totalitarian Earth Defense Force, the planet has been terraformed into a fledgling new Earth, with towns, mines and infrastructure, albeit with a heavy cost. Guerrilla is a game about destruction, violence and a policy of blow the ever-loving fuck out of those guys first and ask questions later. As Alec Mason, you carve a path of death and destruction across the Red Planet, tearing through houses, bridges and industrial centres in your mission to stop the evil EDF before they can deploy their new planet killer weapon. At its core, it focuses on the tactic of its namesake. Guerrilla combat is your friend here. You are both outnumbered and outgunned, so you must use your wits and repurposed mining equipment to wreak havoc on the EDF in any way you can. Over the course of this video we will take a look at all aspects of this game from the single player to the multiplayer, but I really want to pay particular attention to how well it manages to use a potentially gimmicky system such as real-time destruction and weave it seamlessly into every facet of the experience in a way that few games ever have. I will also try to contain my excitement and love for this game as best I can and be as objective as possible. However, whether or not that'll work is up for debate. We will also hopefully be looking at answering the question as well as to what exactly made this game so popular and why, unlike its cousin franchise, hasn't the Red Faction series seen an entry in almost a decade. Without further ado, let's take a look at Red Faction Guerrilla. Okay, so I just want to say off the bat that I think the actual story of Red Faction Guerrilla sucks. I'm not going to try and defend it, I really don't think it's worth the time. The characters are either boring or one-dimensional, and the villain, whilst cool, is just really not compelling at all, and basically just a big, bad, bald man who wants to defeat the good guys. However, in brief, I just want to explain the premise because I do think it adds some necessary context to your actions throughout the game. And warning, there are some spoilers ahead, but honestly you shouldn't really be playing this game for its narrative at all. Anyway, you play as Alec Mason, as I've said prior, a mining engineer who's recently moved to Mars to turn a new leaf after some undefined trouble you had back on Earth. Your brother, Dan, welcomes you but is killed early on by the EDF for being involved in the Red Faction. The EDF, or Earth Defense Force for those unaware, were the allies of the first Red Faction who came to Mars and helped liberate the people from the evil Ultor Corporation. Yes, it's the same Ultor from Saints Row 2. After this, they helped terraform the planet to make living on the surface a possibility. And that's great stuff. However, when resources on Earth began to run a bit thin, they found that the mines on Mars were hugely profitable, and in the process of organising the planet, became an authoritarian occupying force. Basically, EDF bad. There really isn't much else to it. Every single thing they do in this game is pretty much morally bankrupt, and, you know, that's completely okay in my opinion. Not every single game has to have meaningful undercurrents or themes. I mean, this game does, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't try to paint the EDF in any more a good light than, let's say, Wolfenstein does with the Nazis. They're objectively bad people doing objectively bad things. That's all you need as a player to begin your path of terror and destruction. It sort of legitimizes your actions as well, even if the tactics you use may be a bit terrorist in nature. And to be honest, this really fits in with the series as a whole too. I mean, the Red Faction franchise is definitely not AAA. In fact, I would argue they're more akin to the likes of B-movies than Hollywood blockbusters. They have an obviously lower budget than a lot of their contemporaries and are far, far more likely to give you a good chuckle as opposed to a hair-raising introspective story. They use their sci-fi campiness to great effect by framing a narrative that, yes, could happen on Earth, but works so much better in an off-world setting. Anyway, after Dan's death you join the Red Faction, and that's pretty much it. You fight for them and become their poster boy for a new revolution. There are some admittedly cool throwbacks and references to previous games towards the midpoint of the story, especially with the Marauders, but I don't want to ruin them here because that's pretty much the best part of the story. For the most part though, the story takes a major backseat to the gameplay. However, whilst yes, I'm not a fan of the story or narrative by any stretch, I think that the world the story and game inhabits is actually quite phenomenal. Like, perhaps one of the best, most underappreciated universes of any open world game to date. Many reviewers at the time of its release, and even today, state that the world feels empty and barren, with only pockets of life interspersed throughout. And yeah, I mean, they're not wrong, it is pretty barren. And apart from the obvious reason for this being the limitations of the hardware at the time of its release, and the level of interactivity that this game offers with all its structures, do you not think this kind of fits the whole premise of the game? Because I do. It's thematically consistent with Mars being this incredibly hostile and negative place to live. The whole point of this game is to try and overthrow the oppressors of the people. The fact that this world too is also an oppressive, barren dust bowl just adds to the overall feeling of being at the bottom of the barrel. You're a true underdog in your fight for survival, where you must not only fight against a well-armed and well-trained military presence, but also the almost certain feeling of desperation and loneliness that being essentially stranded on another planet must bring. God, I just love this world so much. It's like a perfect sci-fi setting. In a lot of ways too, it resembles a number of other fantastic, timeless sci-fi worlds in its art style and technology. Dead Space or early Alien films spring to mind as some good examples. Everything you use, every building you find, and all the clothing people wear looks so utilitarian and grounded. It feels like a world that's been lived in. Your equipment, for example, is all just either repurposed mining equipment or weapons stolen from EDF or Marauders. You have to make do with what you have, and the design of everything is chunky and robust. Even the buildings too, for the most part. But as well as this, the designs change based on the location and speciality that that location has in the industry of Mars. Few places are what you would describe as futuristic, and even when they are obviously not industry focused, which is especially apparent in the later portions of the game, they still feel like they were built to withstand the elements and serve a purpose. And that's what really gets me about this game, and more so this world. It's just so tangible. It looks like what a fledgling terraformed Mars might actually look like, and the barren expanses of desert that take up the majority of the landscape really do add to the general feeling of seclusion and desperation that this game is trying to evoke. Anyway, that's probably enough about that. What I really want to talk about is how this game plays, and how its insanely impressive technology really makes it stand out from the crowd. So, I've got one phrase: GEO-MOD. If you're familiar with the Red Faction franchise, you probably know what this is, but to the uninitiated, GEO-MOD is the engine that powers all of the titles in the series. In the first game, it allowed players to mine into the walls of caves and around locked doors with an admittedly impressive level of fidelity. That is, of course, taken into consideration that this game is almost 20 years old. Holes could be blasted with mining charges, rockets, and basically any explosives that you could find, and you could in theory create your own tunnel network within the walls of the levels, especially in multiplayer. However, whilst this game marketed itself on this technology and touted its destruction as a revolutionary and breakthrough system and major selling point for the game, which, I mean, I guess it was, at the end of the day, it was just one big gimmick. The destruction system was never really used, it never really amounted to much. There wasn't actually that much you could do with it. which I guess is fair enough given the kind of hardware they were working with at the time. I mean, it's cool, don't get me wrong, and any chance I got to play it as a kid I always marvelled at how insane it was that I could actually blast holes in the walls, but the gameplay itself does not really use its destruction to the advantage of the game. I mean, of course it's there. As I said, you could bypass locked doors and the like, as well as destroy areas of cover and get to your enemies, but in reality the game was much more in line with the likes of Half-Life or, I don't know, Perfect Dark? It's a fairly run-of-the-mill, early 2000s first-person shooter at heart, and no amount of cool destruction effects are going to change that. Nevertheless, GEO-MOD, the name as well as the premise of the technology, was pretty successful, and it really was one of the most defining features of the first game. It has allowed it to be remembered far more fondly than I think it probably has any right to be, especially considering how they screwed up its sequel. With the development of Guerrilla, Volition decided to take the series in a new direction, taking cues from games such as Grand Theft Auto and their own series, Saints Row, which was, up until that point, still a fairly serious, if slightly less mature version of GTA. So, no longer a first-person shooter where you run and gun your way through tunnels and office complexes, Guerrilla would take place on the surface, in an open-world destruction sandbox. This open world meant that the new generation of the GEO-MOD technology would need to be hugely altered from the originals in order to accommodate not only an open world, but also up-to-date lighting, ragdoll physics, and of course, most importantly, its destruction system, which saw a drastic shift away from modifying the terrain itself to becoming focused on realistic structural and infrastructure destruction, with particular attention paid to the stresses a half-destroyed structure would go under before collapsing. GEO-MOD 2.0, as that next-gen engine came to be known, is a technical marvel. That's is, not was, because even 10 years after its release, Red Faction Guerrilla will wow and impress you with its simply jaw-dropping showcases of real-time destruction. The gameplay throughout this video is all captured whilst playing the 2018 re-release, the awfully titled Remastered Edition, which came with slightly improved lighting, textures, and volumetric effects. However, the basis of the original 2009 game really isn't that much different, and the destruction system, as far as I'm aware anyway, remains pretty much exactly the same. Most of the improvements were quality of life upgrades to running on modern systems, increased resolution support for example. Anyway, I digress. I'm not sure whether the engine came before the idea for the game or whether the game sprung up out of what developments had been made, but in any case, GEO-MOD 2.0 seemed to be on a trajectory to change the way video games would handle destruction, with Red Faction Guerrilla looking poised to show just how well a gimmick can be integrated into the very soul of a project, becoming interwoven into the fabric of the game itself. Whilst the destruction of Red Faction 1 was a true novelty, only being allowed at certain points and with certain services, Guerrilla bases everything around it, from its main story missions to the side missions to the intermission free-roam gameplay all the way into the multiplayer. Every aspect of this game incentivizes the player to wreak destruction and mayhem on their surroundings. To really make this point clear, let's just have a look at how the game works. The map is split into a number of sectors, all of which are controlled by the EDF. You have Parker, Dust, the Badlands, Oasis, the Free Fire Zone, and finally EOS. Each of these sectors has about 3 main story missions, a unique style of architecture and vehicles, as well as a heap of side content. In order to beat the game, you must complete all of the story missions in all of the areas, as well as completely remove the EDF influence. Once a sector is complete, you move on to the next, in the order that I specified, and you repeat this until the game is done. Sounds simple, right? And yeah, I guess it is. But often, the last mission in an area can't even be attempted until all the EDF influence has been removed. And do you want to take a guess at just how you might go about doing that? Well, you've probably guessed it anyway, but it's by literally destroying everything that the EDF owns. Whether that be small outposts, bridges, or huge military bases, it's all fair game in your fight. As well as this, you may want to engage in any number of side activities. These include house arrests, rampages, destruction challenges, and perhaps most tame of all, vehicle delivery, as well as a couple of others. Whilst the latter of those involves just driving a car, the prior all involve some form of demolition. My favourite personally being the house arrests, mainly because you can't just destroy everything you see willy-nilly. Inside the designated buildings are hostages that you need to rescue and take back to your safe house in the region. Once you approach the building, the EDF will notice you and engage, whether you're in a car or not. Now, under normal circumstances, you might just choose to annihilate everyone you see and level the building with some mining charges, but in this case you can't. You actually have to be rather conservative in your efforts so as to protect the hostages and get them away safely. They can and will die, rather quickly if you're not careful, upon which you will fail the mission outright and must restart. All of these side missions erode the EDF influence in a region and allow you to access more upgrades and weapons to purchase at the safe house. But that's just a small part of it. In your travels between missions or tasks, you may come across an EDF checkpoint or a propaganda sign or any number of supply crates or fuel tanks. Destroying these will also decrease the influence in the region, albeit only slightly. The real target of your free roam escapades are the sort of unique EDF landmarks that you'll find dotted across each of the sectors. These can take the form of a large piece of machinery or a military base, or even, in perhaps one of the most impressive examples, a genuinely massive bridge that spans a huge canyon. These targets are often surrounded by all manner of smaller targets such as bunkers or barracks, as well as plenty of guards. They're the crown jewels of the EDF in each region, and as a result will massively impact their foothold. To account for this, they're often pretty hard to just walk up to and take down. They require planning, preparation, and in all honesty, a fair amount of luck to complete, especially some of the more substantial structures found in the later regions. They feel like mini emergent missions outside of missions. The battles that take place around them are often very cinematic and seem to have this sort of unscripted 3-act story to them. You have the first approach and engagement, for example, which is where you often crash a vehicle through a perimeter wall or charge the main gate. For this first section, you will have moderate resistance, sure, but you're free to start destroying everything you see or start making your way to the prime target, usually nestled in the centre of a base. The more you progress and enter into the second act of sorts, the more resistance you will come across. And towards the midpoint of the game, air support will start to be called in on you, resulting in you either being forced to take cover indoors or, alternatively, waste precious ammunition in taking it down. However, they will just keep coming. The EDF has an unlimited supply of men and munitions, and you still have to just push on. Dodging grenades and rockets, buildings and cover will collapse around you as you try to destroy as much as you can, raising your wanted level more and more. At the climax of these sections, you will reach max red alert status and may even find tanks being sent after you, which are ridiculously difficult to destroy without ample equipment. It's at this moment, and crawling into Act 3 of the attack, that you really must escape, whether your objective is complete or not. Finding a vehicle is paramount, as you will no doubt be low on ammunition, and the EDF will be swarming your position. You grab a car, escape through the wreckage, and then engage in a chase, all the way back to your safe house, where you will, thankfully, be relieved of your wanted level. It's a thrill, and I promise you it never gets old, even on repeated playthroughs. The destruction is woven so seamlessly into the game that in the process of writing this retrospective, I was still realising ways that it achieves it. For instance, I mentioned that you can upgrade your equipment and buy new weapons at your safe house. Well, the only way of doing this is by collecting your currency in the game, salvage. You can probably already imagine where you get this from, I'm sure, but I just want to talk about it for a second. Every structure or vehicle you destroy in the game nets you salvage, which will lie strewn about the floor for you to pick up. And generally it's only a couple of pieces at a time, but considering the amount of things you'll be blowing up or destroying over just a short play session, this does add up rather quickly. The more you destroy, the more salvage you gain, and the quicker you can purchase upgrades. As well as man-made objects, salvage can also be collected from mining ore deposits, which can be found in abundance across the map. The ore pieces dropped from a mine deposit generally net you more salvage than your generic scrap metal found after a building has collapsed, especially with a couple of early game upgrades to increase yields. So, as a result of this system being tied to the previously outlined activities and missions, the game creates a rewarding, very cathartic positive feedback loop of exploration, destruction and reward, perhaps more so in this game than in any other. The gimmick, in quotes, is actually the driving force behind the entire experience. It's the essence of what the game is. Even the multiplayer, which takes a couple of different forms, bases nearly all of its content on being a sandbox of destruction and physics. Wrecking Crew in particular, which is a sort of party mode, bases all of its modes on some form of demolition within certain constraints. such as cause as much damage as possible in 1 minute, or cause as much damage with limited ammo, or use a walker to do as much damage as possible, etc, etc. I'm sure you get the gist. It all revolves around the use of the destruction engine to earn points and win the round. These are fun too. The limited scope of the levels, which are all shared with the multiplayer too I believe, offer just enough variety to allow for many hours of repeated plays, swapping out different weapons, challenging friends to only using certain equipment, or just having a blast. It can be played in both past the controller or online with friends over Steam. Each player then takes turns to earn points in the challenge, and the winner of the most rounds wins the game. These are short, sweet, and pure demonstrations of how to further implement your selling point into all aspects of the game. The true multiplayer too, whilst I only have limited playtime, does offer a similar sort of experience. Traditional modes such as Deathmatch and Team Deathmatch are present, as well as Capture the Flag and Domination. However, all of these have the twist of being in, again, completely destructible environments. The map at the start of a match will look completely different by the end, as players knock through walls and structures in a pursuit of winning the match. This in turn makes tactics such as camping, which is often very popular in multiplayer shooters, become essentially useless, as you'll very rarely, if ever, find a location that is safe from the onslaught of rockets, explosives and gunfire. Buildings will collapse and crumble, cover will chip away, and you will end up fighting in wholly different landscapes by the end of the match. As well as the usual modes that accompany these sort of multiplayer suites, Guerrilla also includes a couple of unique modes that of course revolve around destruction as their primary hook. Siege, for example, is a mode where teams must attack and defend key structures across the map. This mode even has specific maps built for it in order to accommodate for the frantic action that it brings. Once one building is destroyed, you move on to the next, and so on. Only once all buildings are destroyed within the time limit do the attacking team win. Otherwise, the victory goes to the defenders. It's a mode that I would honestly like to see more in games, perhaps some of the Battlefield titles, and I know, they do have Rush, which is kinda similar, but I just can't help imagining what it would be like if the whole point of the mode was to actually level the designated building, like Bad Company 2 or Battlefield 4 style. Anyway, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. Demolition is another fairly unique mode where one team must escort one player, who is designated as the Destroyer, around the map as they destroy all of the structures they can. The other team must stop them. Each round they swap, and the team with the most points at the end of the match wins. And these modes are simple, yet remarkably effective and exciting detours from the main content of the game, offering potentially hours upon hours of value to whoever can be bothered to put in the time and boot it up. I'm unfortunately not one of those people, because I prefer the single player, but I can absolutely see the appeal that this game has with online destructive mayhem. And what's more impressive is how the engine handles the destruction online in the first place. Having all of the players see pretty much the same levels of destruction across the map at the same time must have been a colossal networking and development task. The persistence of that kind of dynamic map is notoriously difficult to get right, and whilst Guerrilla isn't perfect at it, it does a remarkably good job at keeping all of the players concurrently seeing the same thing, whilst also tracking and computing hit registration and player movement or location. Again, this just adds to the obvious talent and passion present at Volition to create and maintain such a complex yet thoroughly enjoyable and casual experience. It never feels like it takes the power away from the player for 1 second. With all this positivity then, isn't it a bit odd that the series disappeared? Well, yes and no, really. It's complicated. I mean, it's true. This game is well loved by those who've played it and is often labelled as an underrated, underappreciated gem, which in all honesty was true until 2018, but then it got a remaster. The real kicker though is that Volition, who had already popularised and killed the franchise once before with the first 2 games, did it again with the third-person reboots. In 2011 they released Red Faction Armageddon, a linear story-based continuation from Guerrilla that would take place underground, in much the same kind of setting that the first game had about 10 years prior. maintaining the third-person nature and Mason family story, but swapping out the free-form destruction sandbox for a linear, literal corridor shooter with very little to no chance to flex the destructive capabilities of an even more upgraded version of the GEO-MOD engine. What's worse about the whole fiasco is that in doing this, they also added a multitude of new, exciting guns and tools for the player to play around with, such as the Reconstructor tool, which I know was present in multiplayer in Guerrilla, which was able to rebuild structures, or a magnet gun that draws objects together at insane speeds. These are really fun and engaging things to play around with, especially with the improved physics and destruction. Yet, all of this was wasted on a bad story in a bad setting with aliens and a gameplay loop that was less about having fun and more about going from point A to point B. And it's a real shame. A massive kick in the teeth for all those who had poured hours into Guerrilla and supported it even with its flaws. You can pretty much blame Armageddon personally for the fall of the series and the sole reason why we haven't had a new entry in almost 10 years at the time of writing. In conclusion then, play Red Faction Guerrilla. Do it. Go out and buy it in the next Steam sale. You won't regret it. It's one of the most cathartic and enjoyable open world games ever made, a masterclass in not only technology, but how a good gimmick, when implemented properly, can really be the heart and soul of a project. It is a shame that we haven't seen an entry in so long, but if the rumours are to be believed, there is one coming. Red Faction Extinction has been hinted at for a couple of years now, and with THQ Nordic now at the helm, we can only hope that they pull off the incredible and make a truly next-gen Red Faction experience. And we can only imagine what that might entail. Thank you for watching. I appreciate everyone who watches my videos and engages with me in the comments, so if you have anything to say, both positive or negative, please drop it in the comments below, and as always, leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in the next video. Cheers.